Hey class, so what we're going to do is look at the responses that you all created on September 10th using a specific chart from the sentencing project. So I'm going to post a link so that you can look at all the charts, because I know some of you might be interested in seeing what other people created, but you want the chart as reference. And we're also going to look at some of the charts in class on Wednesday. So again, the charts will be listed on Blackboard and in class on Wednesday. The other thing I just want to point out to you is you will see the 3 points or 2 points or 1 point that you received for this assignment in Blackboard. So if you know that you did this assignment, I went over the assignment in this video and you're not seeing anything, then make sure you email me or talk to me, because we want to make sure you get the credit that you earned. And then secondly, you can watch this video in a number of ways. You can watch the entire video and see what everyone else came up with and learn from, you know, some mistakes that they made and some strengths that they have. Or you can choose to go into the description and look at where your name is and what minute you'll find feedback for your specific paragraph. Again, either or is absolutely fine. There's not going to be a quiz. However, it's important for you to know what specific struggles you have so that you don't repeat them or you try to improve upon them for your future writing assignments. All right, so let's start. Ooh. Okay, I'm going to probably do that a lot. All right, so the first one. Based on the report by the Sentencing Project, the article argued the topic of race and ethnicity finds its way in the incarcerations of young juvenile delinquents. The rate of youth in residential placement chart reveals that black youth are ranked the highest out of 5 from being incarcerated because the punishments and sentences more likely depends on color. Compared to other races, they would be subjected to longer terms in prison. So let's look at the introductory statement. You'll notice I already bolded some comments I immediately had. Mostly they're grammatical and some are just like clarity issue. But here, when a lot of you did this, the Sentencing Project is a title, and so yes, it's a piece, so it needs to be in quotes. Right? Anything that's a title needs to be either in quotes or italicized, depending on whether it's a whole body of work or it's a part of something. So immediately you want to make sure you put that in quotes. I will do that now just so that you see how it would look. Right? The article, now this is something that a lot of us did as well. Is it an article? As much as it's a data sheet, I wouldn't call it an article, right? It's not words that are, you know, there's not an introduction, body paragraphs, and a conclusion. It's data. So I would call it a fact sheet, data, chart, research, right? But I would definitely not call it an article. Article suggests something different. And that's something that's a good lesson for you all to learn. When you're talking about a piece of work, you want to identify it properly. So we have the article argue. Now, if the article or the fact sheet or the data or the chart is singular, then the verb needs to be singular as well. Now, we talked about this, but let's talk about it one more time. In present tense, right? When verbs are in present tense, singular subjects must have singular verbs. Now in present tense, the way that you make a singular verb singular, or you make a verb singular, is usually just by adding s. If it's a plural verb, a plural subject, sorry, then it needs to be a plural verb. And the way that you make a verb plural is just by having it be in its true form, right? Or its original form. That is no S. So if it was they argue, that's correct. But if it's the chart, which is the singular thing, it should be argues. I just want you to see that if it's in a different tense, it's doesn't get impacted, right? The chart argued, they argued. In past tense, the verb is the same. It's only when you're dealing with present tense, which makes it so difficult of a concept for us to really grasp. But it's important that you do that because you'll notice a lot of your instructors, including me, will say when you're talking about sources, you should talk about them in the present tense. So this is a rule that you want to make sure you're clear on. All right, so that was a little grammar lesson. We have the topic of race and ethnicity finds its way in the incarcerations of young juvenile delinquents. Now, this is something, it's just wordy. If you're trying to say that race and ethnicity, first of all, yeah, so you're trying to say race and ethnicity is a factor in young people being incarcerated, then I would say it in active form. So you have the article argues, young people are incarcerated because of their race and ethnicity, right? How is this active? Because the subject is here and the verb follows the subject. When the verb follows the subject, aka the subject is doing the verb, then it becomes active. When you have the verb starting the sentence and the subject happening after, then it is passive. Now, passive is technically grammatically correct. However, it usually leads to wordy phrases. So again, that's something that you want to practice in your summary, having an active voice. All right, so then aside from the grammatical stuff that's going on, it seems like this group is saying that their particular fact sheet is arguing that young people are incarcerated because of race and ethnicity, which is a fine introductory statement once it's been clarified, and we're hoping that we'll see some support in the body paragraph. And then you'll see here, the students say the rate of youth in residential placement chart. Now again, if this is the title of the chart, it needs to be indicated by either quotes or being italicized. Additionally, it should be capitalized, right? Titles of things should always be capitalized. Now, when it says reveals that black youth are ranked the highest out of 5 from being incarcerated, the use of prepositions is misleading. It's not that they're from this land called incarceration. They are ranked the highest out of 5 for being incarcerated or to become incarcerated, but from is the incorrect preposition. So I would recommend for anyone who struggles with this, but specifically this group, that they look up the differences between prepositional phrases. That's not something I'm going to go into right now. Okay, so then we're talking about the chart. We're talking about the chart revealing that the incarceration rate is especially high for black youth. And then we have, compared to other races, they would be subjected to longer terms in prison. And that's it. And so I have, so what, not to be rude and facetious, but to say, okay, so that's what the chart reveals. Why should readers care, right? Remember, you want to explain, you want to reflect, and really indicate why this is problematic, why is this important, because otherwise you just have 2 sentences that clearly state what the chart is reporting, but that's it. All right, so we're going to move on. Hopefully that was helpful. Next, in the article, again, is it an article? Felony disenfranchisement. The reporter argues how disenfranchisement affects the voting system across the United States. So again, I'm not going to do it all over, but it's not an article, it's a chart. And because it's a chart, there's not necessarily a reporter. You might want to say the research argues, or and it's not really arguing, but so we don't want to put the research, but the data argues disenfranchisement affects the voting system across the United States, right? That would be clearer. So again, it's not a reporter and it's not an article, so clarify that. but it's a fine topic sentence because it seems like you're going to really look at how voting rights are impacted. All right. Then we have the reporter explains. Now clearly this needs to be revised, right? The reporter explains how felony conviction can result a person losing their voting rights depending on the state they reside in. So what you're really saying is felons or people who are convicted of a felony can lose their voting rights. I would just say that felony convictions lead to a loss of voting rights. Right? Now, if you wanted to add the fact that it's depending on what state, felony convictions lead to a loss of voting rights depending on the state, the felon, the convicted. I don't like using the word felon. On the state the convicted person resides in, right? So we keep your wording, it's just that we can make it clear. The can result a person, something can result in something, right? Again, we need to talk about prepositions, but can result a person is not a real thing. It's an awkward phrase, mostly because that phrase doesn't exist. So can result in a person losing their voting rights would be stronger than the way it was before, or you can use this as, a model. All right. In some state, if you're saying some, that automatically assumes that there's more than one. So this should say states, not state. There is no, and again, some states means plural. There is a verb, right? So it should be, it should be in plural tense. So there are no restrictions, even if you have a felony. I'm not sure what this is, to be quite honest. So just in terms of citation, MLA only need author and page number. That's it. So that needs correcting. While other state restores people's voting rights after they complete their prison sentence. Now, the voting rights belong to the people, right? So you want to make sure it's possessive by having the apostrophe. Okay, so here we have a fact. Felony conviction results in the loss of voting rights, and then you give us some information about how, some states will keep your voting rights restricted, others will give you back your voting rights once you've completed your prison sentence. But the thing to realize is you talk above about how disenfranchisement happens when you lose your voting rights. So you need to explain how this can lead to disenfranchisement. And I think the biggest thing would be to look up what disenfranchisement actually means. It really means that you become separated from the community that you belong to, right? Disenfranchised groups are often groups that don't have a voice. So you would just want to have that clear in a sentence. Then we have, moreover, due to the 5.85 million Americans are not allowed to vote based on state restriction. Now, this is something I want you to be aware of. When you start a sentence with due to the, right, it assumes that there's going to be something that is directly related to this clause. So, due to the bad weather, class is canceled. So due to this is happening. Because this is the case, this is now the consequence. Now notice here, due to the Americans who are not allowed to vote based on state restriction, nothing happens though. There's nothing that you're explaining. What happens because 5 million people are disenfranchised? Or what happens because 5 million people are not allowed to vote? That needs to be clarified. Or not even clarified, that needs to be inserted in the sentence. Otherwise, this becomes a fragment or an incomplete sentence. Disenfranchisement affects people of all races and different types of population. Based on the article, how disenfranchisement varies by races, especially those of black race. It can also hurt the population of each state by eliminating 25% of state voters across the nation. This is partially related to the thesis statement, or sorry, the introductory statement. However, it feels jumpy, mostly because this sentence is unclear. So I would like to know, I think what would have helped is if you said here, because 5 million people are not allowed to vote, this leaves a large number of Americans disenfranchised, right? Then you say that this affects people of all races and different types of population. But then you say the disenfranchisement can vary by race, especially those of black race. I would like to know what you mean. Are you saying that disenfranchisement looks differently depending on what race you are? Or are you saying that races are disenfranchised at different rates? That's unclear. So overall, there's just, I think if we had more time, things that need to be clarified and even just pushed a little further in terms of explanation. So you've gotten the facts from the chart, but now it's your job to explain what it means, which is the toughest part about writing from numbers, but it's an important skill to develop. All right, next. The incarceration rate throughout the years in the United States compared to different countries around the world has increased by a large amount because more people are getting arrested for the possession of drugs and unreasonable charges. Excellent. Grammatically, when you have a list of two things, right, you don't need that comma. That comma is only important if you have a list of more than two items. In the New Jim Crow, Alexander introduces the conflict within the... Again, I told you I'm going to do this a lot. In the New Jim Crow, Alexander introduces the conflict within the justice system. In the war on drugs, people of color and lower class are the main target. Cops are misusing their powers, stopping people because they have a hunch. For example, police officers find an excuse, such as traffic violation, to pull people of color over to search their car for drugs. When people are put in jail, they sometimes do not have a trial, and some die in jail or prison waiting for a trial date. Judges have control whether the person would be found guilty and have a housing punishment or found innocent. So spelling is an issue here, right? And I know you guys wrote this assignment, but you still want to get in the habit of knowing immediately how to spell certain words. Misusing is one word. It's important to know that trial and trail are different, because even in Word, you'll see trail is spelled correctly, but trail means something completely different. And when you're talking about whether or not something should happen, it's spelled that way. That's important for you to know. So this is a little paragraph on the New Jim Crow, but I'm kind of wondering where the information about the chart is, or where did you pull information from the chart? Right now it seems as though this is a great introductory statement. This shows that, you know, cops are really using the war on drugs as a way to stop specific people, but I want more about the data, right? Maybe there can be a way that the data could support some of Alexander's assertions, but that's not clear. So then I just want to make sure I talk about everything. So I say in the war on drugs, and then I say prepositional phrase. Oh, that's what okay, I'm just trying to figure out my notes. When you start a sentence with a prepositional phrase, and in the New Jim Crow or in the war on drugs, right? In is a preposition. So this whole thing becomes a prepositional phrase. After the phrase is over, you need to make sure you have a comma, right? That's a really minor thing, but a very important lesson to learn so that you can master comma usage. All right. Next. The increase in incarceration through the years is due to the changes in how criminals are being sentenced. Grammatically, there's no need for a comma here because we talked about one reason you need a comma, right? Prepositional phrase starts the sentence. For example, in the book due to the fact from an early age, right? These are all phrases that would need commas. The other time you need a comma is when you have a dependent clause and then an independent clause. Now, let's look. The increase in incarceration, that's not, so technically that's a dependent clause, right? If you were to look at it in that way, it can't function on its own. However, through the years is due to the changes in how criminals are being sentenced. That's not an independent clause. That doesn't make sense either on its own. And so we don't want to separate these two with a comma, because that would mean that this is dependent and this is able to make sense on its own, which is not true. The increase in incarceration through the years is due to the changes in how criminals are being sentenced. Now, when you don't need a comma, whoops, is when you have an independent clause and then a dependent clause. So look here. The increase in incarceration through the years is due to the changes in how criminals are being sentenced. So this would be an independent clause, right? The increase in incarceration through the years is due to the changes. That could exist on its own. And then in how criminals are being sentenced is dependent. And you kind of know it's dependent because it starts with a preposition. And you'll see when you have an independent followed by a dependent, you don't need a comma. So all that to say, this is a fabulous sentence, but fabulous introductory statement, but grammatically careful of how you use commas. All right. As a result of harsher sentencing, petty crimes have had a major impact on the increase of imprisonment. Excellent. In the new Jim Crow, remember, you want to italicize this. Now, I don't remember, but I think you might have underlined it, so I'm going to leave that alone. Alexander explains that there are stricter penalties for minor drug offenses now. In 1980, there were 320 prisoners, and as of 2013, there was a dramatic increase. As shown in the graph in the sentencing project. Again, this should be in quotes. More criminals in jail lead to overcrowding. Once in the system, offenders were more likely to end up behind bars again, which causes a vicious cycle of constant incarceration. Now here, there can never be a sentence that starts with which usually is a part of a larger sentence. It's a dependent clause, so it can't exist on its own. This is an excellent response. I particularly think the choice to look at Alexander first and then use the data to support Alexander is a strong choice, and it's one that you could definitely see being useful in a literature review that looks at incarceration rate. So that was excellent. All right. Oh my gosh, I don't know why I keep doing that. All right. The war on drugs reinforces racial disparity by seeking to incarcerate in great numbers and creating a prison cycle instead of a solution to drug use. Great. So what these students are saying is the war on drugs causes a cycle of incarceration that doesn't really solve the real issue at hand, similar to what Nadelman is saying. When looking at the incarceration rate by race and ethnicity per 100,000 people in 2013, 2,085 black men were incarcerated as opposed to 478 white men in prison. Excellent. I particularly like the brave decision to really get in there and talk some numbers. Just make sure you're citing though. So it should really say according to, or in parentheses, right? It should say, one second. It should say in the sentencing project. Systematically, the war on drugs has enabled officers to do at will unlawful searches, most of which are done on minorities. In the new Jim Crow, now this should be italicized, not in quotes. However, when you're handwriting things, and obviously, unless you're super talented, you can't handwrite italics. You can just underline it. So again, in the new Jim Crow, hopefully you guys are watching still and are saying, hey, that's a prepositional phrase, and you're right. Alexander reports how in 1993, police wanted to stop 2 black men without probable cause or reasonable suspicion, but decided to stop and search them for a traffic violation. In reality, the officers, right, the motives belong to the officers, were to search for drugs. Although the officers did find drugs in the car, this shows how this war on drugs allows internal prejudices of officers to legally criminalize black men. In fact, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics Sentencing Project, okay, so this phrasing for me is awkward. In 2013, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment was 1 in 3 black men versus 1 in 17 white men at risk. There will continue being racial injustices and disparity within the prison system until there is a solution that will help decrease drug use instead of placement of minorities in prison. All right, so let's talk about this holistically, right? I've been doing a lot of nitpicking with grammar. What works about this is the fact that it really does talk about numbers and that it's really focusing on the way race is used to, or sorry, the war on drugs is used to criminalize race. That's great. What I'm not so sure of, though, is how this is related to the solution, using a different solution. You'll notice in your topic sentence, you really talk about how we need to find a solution to the drug problem instead of criminalizing and incarcerating, which gives the impression that you're going to talk about that in some way in this paragraph. And you kind of do when you have this concluding sentence. I think this is probably a concluding sentence. But I think if you set yourself up to say you're going to talk about that, you should definitely talk about it at least in a paragraph of its own. That's just my suggestion. The other thing is, I'm not really sure I understand how you've broken down the numbers here. I know you know what the chart is saying, but your reader has not had the privilege to read the data, and so they need you to explain what this data actually means. Does this mean 1 in 3 black men will be incarcerated, whereas 1 in 17 white men will be incarcerated, or does this mean that they're more at risk? That's something that you would want to clarify for your reader. But otherwise, this is a really excellent well put together paragraph. All right, let's move on. In the sentencing project, racial disparities, okay, again, quotes, argues that people of color are most likely to be incarcerated. Excellent. The sentencing project states that more than 60% of the people in prison today are people of color. So when it comes down to colored people, more than half will be incarcerated for many reasons. All right, so this is something I do want to say because it's worthwhile to note it. You need to be conscious of the connotations of certain words and certain phrases. I don't recommend using the phrase colored people. And this is just something, and you can feel free to disagree with me. I wouldn't mark you down for this. But when you use the phrase colored people, there are some implications, some connotations of ignorance, but not just ignorance, but of prejudice that I don't think you at all are intending. So you can say, people of color, if you're talking about a specific race, maybe, Latino, African American, Indian, but I'm not so sure I would recommend using the phrase colored people. And again, here you can, if you feel like, that's the only phrase you feel comfortable using, but in other classes, just be conscious of the impact it might have on others. All right, so enough of that. Racial profiling being one of the best reasons of why people of color are most likely to be incarcerated. An example of racial profiling would be when a colored man who has never been in any trouble is being stopped by an officer. A colored man did nothing wrong but is assumed of suspicious behavior, which then could lead to him being incarcerated because of what the officer sees. That also proves that the statistics shown in racial disparities that most colored men have a higher rate of being incarcerated because of their gender and race. Okay, so what works is you take the data and you use it to talk about what you are specifically interested in, which is racial profiling. That's excellent. What also works is that you're really interested in gender and race being a reason for racial profiling. That's excellent as well. What needs to be improved, though, is best reason. That's a awkward phrasing. It's not like you're super excited about racial profiling. You're saying it's one of the most common reasons. So be careful of the way that you pick your words. Best implies something positive, and I don't think that's necessarily what you intended. And the other thing is here, I just want to, so sentence structure-wise, and if you want more practice, you can review the examples I gave earlier on. You have a lot of improper use of commas. So remember we talked about when you have an independent clause and then a dependent clause, you don't need a comma. So an example of racial profiling would be when a colored man who has never been in any trouble is being stopped by an officer. So an example of racial profiling would be when a colored man who has never been in any trouble is being stopped by an officer. I'm trying to see. This is not an easy sentence for me to explain in terms of why it doesn't need a comma. But it doesn't. The only way that I could sort of break it down is there's no point in this sentence where I could split it and you have an independent clause and a dependent clause, right? So if I break it down, an example of racial profiling would be when it still can't exist on its own, and a colored man who has never been in any trouble is being stopped by an officer. Oh, well, I guess technically that's independent, huh? And yet you don't need a comma. Interesting. Interesting. And the real reason why you don't need a comma is because the when technically is part of this clause, because the when is being described here. I know that's a really bad explanation, but it's the best one I can give you. The reason why this doesn't need a comma is because there's no separation. This entire sentence is independent, and you can't break it off and find another independent and dependent clause. So hopefully that was like 5% useful. Other than that, this is a really sound paragraph with a clear introductory statement. So just, be mindful of giving quotes for titles and sentence structure. Or rather, don't put commas just because you're unsure of where they go. Really use the rules of commas, which is if you have a dependent clause, then you have a comma followed by an independent clause. Or if you start your sentence with a prepositional phrase, then you need a comma. Otherwise, you don't need to just put commas everywhere. All right. The Sentencing Project has reported how over the years, okay, let's just read it. Since 1980, the number of people being incarcerated for drug offenses has increased dramatically. Drug policy is unfair, and the only way to change it is to end war on drugs. The Sentencing Project provides us with faces of how the drug policy today has a major impact on the number of people in prison. It is shown through cumulative information the increase of individuals being incarcerated from the year 80 to 2013, going from approximately 18% of those arrests being from drug offense in 1980 to being approximately 30% in 2013. It's also high-level actors in the drug trade, and most have no prior criminal record. Sentencing project. This goes out to show that the drug policy is being unreasonable. Instead of focusing on actual drug dealers, police tend to make action on all those with possession on drugs. All right, so what I want to do is, let's see, how can I do this? All right, let's first talk about this first paragraph. The Sentencing Project has reported how over the years. Now, if I were to say that to you and just leave, you would be confused. You would not know what I was saying, mostly because I didn't finish my thought. So, and you should really know this, because when you say how over the years, I'm expecting you to say how over the years blah 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 happened, right? And there's nothing. So this is a fragment, right? Now let's say we connect, oftentimes when you put a period and it's a fragment, you could sometimes just connect the sentence after. So let's see how this works. How over the years since 1980, the number of people being incarcerated for drug offense has increased dramatically. That's a little better, but just note something. Over the years implies you're not really sure of a specific starting point, and then you have since 1980. So you can't have these two exist in the same sentence. It's either that you're talking about since 1980 or you're wanting to be general and talking about over the years. I'm going to say you want to talk specifics, so the Sentencing Project has reported how since 1980, the number of people being incarcerated for drug offense has increased dramatically. Excellent. Drug policy is unfair, and the only way to change it is to end the war on drugs. Excellent. So you're looking at how the number of people incarcerated has increased, and you're going to look at how policy needs to change, and the only way to change policy is to end the war on drugs. Great. Now let's go to this. The Sentencing Project provides us, and now again this needs to be in quotes and it should be capitalized, right? Provides us with faces of how the drug policy today has a major impact on the number of people in prison. I think you meant facts. Oops. It is shown through cumulative information the increase of individuals being incarcerated. Okay, so the issue I'm having, and for this student or for these students, this is something you really want to pay attention to, because I'm going to note it over and over. You're way too wordy. And when I say wordy, you're saying the same thing over and over again, but nothing's really being moved forward. So your first sentence said, since 1980, people are incarcerated more and more. This sentence says, policy affects the people in prison. Same thing that this sentence said. And then this sentence says, there's an increase, right? So all of these three sentences are saying the same thing. So ultimately, we don't need them. Going from approximately 18% of those arrested being from drug offense in 1980 to being approximately 30% in 2013. Great, so this is a specific stat that you're giving us. Be careful of starting your paragraph with progressive forms of verbs. They tend to mean that you have a fragment. So instead, you can say, arrests increased from approximately 18% or, this is a simple fix. Approximately 18% of those arrested were arrested for drug offenses in 1980, while in 2013, approximately 30% were arrested for drug offenses. So this is a stat. Then you say it's also high-level actors in the drug trade, and most have no prior criminal record. I'm not sure how this is related to the stat you give us here, and I'm also not sure how you say this goes out to show that the drug policy is being unreasonable. I know that would be nice if you could just give us a stat and then say, duh, this is exactly what you should be seeing, but that's not the case. You need to explain how this, well, how really the stat and the quote indicate unreasonable policy, because right now that's not clear to your reader. So yeah, I think grammatically there's stuff that needs to be taken care of, but I think the biggest issue that you're going to have, or not that you're going to have, that you want to work on is wordiness. If your sentences are saying the same thing over and over and over again, it's just that there's, fluffy, elaborate language, it's not going to work, mostly because the point of any written exercise is for you to explain, for you to take a fact and create something new. So you just want to be careful of that. And I will let you know that I struggled with that same issue for a while. And so what I had to force myself to do is say, okay, so this is what I said in this sentence. What's a new piece of information that I need to bring into the next sentence? And I forced myself to bring something new every sentence, otherwise it could not exist in my paper. All right, so now we're going to look at the last one. For those of you who have stayed tuned for the whole thing, kudos. According to the Sentencing Project, drug policy argues the increased number of drug offenses even though there is the war on drugs. Great, but we talked about this. If you have according to, then you don't need the verb argues. If you have just the title, then you need the argue. So the Sentencing Project, and I would actually just do this. Drug policy argues the increase. Great. You're going to talk about how even though we have a war on drugs, there's still an increased number of drug offenses. The war on drugs claims it might reduce the drug offenses. However, it is increasing the number of criminals. According to Sentencing Project, again, this should be capital and in quotes, from 1980 to 2013, Americans for drug offenses in prison grow from 41,000 to 500,000 people. So tenses is an issue here, right? In 2013, that's past tense. So it has to have grown, or actually grew, past tense. And I don't know what you mean when you say Americans for drug offenses. Do you mean Americans in jail for drug offenses? That needs to be clarified. The war on drugs claims that it might arrested high-level dealers. However, it arrested low-level dealers. When you have might, that's something known as a conditional word, which means that the verb has to be in present tense. So it might arrest, right? Now remember, if it was, I can't think of an example, but so we have it might arrest high-level dealers, however, it arrested low-level dealers. The war on drugs is, and this is a spelling thing, right? Harassing. More than helping them. From the reading, by 2004, people convicted were expected to serve almost 3 times then length, 62 months in prison. I'm not sure what this means. However, all the actors don't have criminal record for a violent offense. Actors, not sure what this means. So I think this needs a revision in really one way. The sentences are unclear in what they're trying to say, and because of that, I'm unsure as to how it's related to your original introductory statement. For me, this paragraph is clear. You're looking at the increase in the prison population, and you're saying, you know, yeah, they're trying to say they're reducing drug offenses, but really what they're doing is increasing the number of criminals. Here, I'm unsure as to what the point is, and I think if you just sort of clarified the subjects and the verbs, it would be easier to figure out the relationship, not for the reader, but for you to understand so that you can create sentences that indicate the relationship. Okay, so we learned a lot, hopefully, and I'm going to now see you on Wednesday, but if you have any questions, feel free to comment them here, or you can email me, and I look forward to seeing you soon, and have a good rest of your holiday.